Welcome to another PowerShell tutorial for beginners. Today, I will go over variables. I have the VS Code open here, and if you need help with setting up this scripting environment, please watch my first tutorial in this series. Before we begin, we need to create a file that will be used for our scripting. To do that, I will be selecting this new file option right here, and this is what you will get when you first open up your Visual Studio Code environment with PowerShell add-on added that we did in our first tutorial. So this is the screen that you should get when you open your VS Studio Code. If you don't see this screen, you can also go into Files menu and select New File. And then from there, you can go ahead and create the file. So for me, I'm just going to click New File here, and it's going to give me this pop-up. And in here, I'm going to type whatever I like to call this file. So I'm going to call it variables. And then I'm going to put .ps1 and then press enter. It gives me the pop-up here, and it's going to ask you whether you should save it right here. So I'm going to put ps1 here, save, and now we have a PowerShell file that can be used for our scripting. And notice on the bottom of your screen that you have the terminal just underneath it, and it shows that the PowerShell extension is added in here, and we have logged in as the administrator. So make sure that you launch your Visual Studio Code in administrator privileges, otherwise some of the codes that we will be covering in the future may not work. To clear your terminal, you can either use CLS or clear command and then press enter. That will clear the terminal and bring it back to the top. So let's look at what are variables. If you have taken any scripting or programming languages, you will probably came across something called variables. So variables are basically used to store all types of data and values. In every programming language, any scripting language that you have come across in the past or now, you will be dealing with variables, and the variables basically store pieces of data or information. In PowerShell, variables do the same thing, basically storing information or data for either for user or for the specific program that you're running. In other words, there's either baked in variables, which mean built-in variables, or variables that user create themselves. In PowerShell, there are three types of variables. Those are automatic, preference, and user created. So the automatic variables store the state of PowerShell. These variables are created by PowerShell itself, and the PowerShell 7 have those variables baked into it, and it maintains this database of variables within this PowerShell structure. Like for example, the variable ps home, that will give us the location in which the PowerShell installation directory in this computer. For example, if I run this code, it'll give me the location where the PowerShell environment is saved. So it is under C users administrator documents ps scripts /variable.ps1, because that's where I have saved that file, and it shows with this particular variable, which we didn't create. It's already baked into our program. So in other words, there are types of variables that is already baked in, and we already went over some of those variables in my previous tutorials. Like for example, you probably remember from my previous tutorial the PS version table. Remember that variable? What that's going to do is basically it's going to give us the version of this PowerShell. So if I run that command, that variable, and that variable gave us the version, so which is the PowerShell version 7.3.2, and it gives the other information display on this table. So this is a variable, and this is also a variable that is what we call the automatic variables, variables that are baked into the PowerShell 7 environment itself. And there are two other types of variables. They include the preference variable and the user created variable. So the preference variables are basically variables that stores user preferences for the PowerShell. These variables are very similar to that of the automatic variables, such as these guys. And they usually have like a default values already populated, but you have the ability to change those values, making it the preference variables as opposed to automatic variables. For example, you can change information contained within the PS variable command right here, the preset PS variable, but you can, however, change information or how the variable behave in things like, let's say, maximum history count, for example. This variable, you can actually change that, the values associated with it. For example, if I run this particular variable, so I'm going to clear the terminal, and then I'm going to just run this part of the code. You notice it spit out a number that is 40,096 or 4096. What that basically means is that's the maximum history count that is by default in there. Notice also that this item right here, this variable up here, is actually colored differently than these variables at the top of the page right now. The reason for that is these variables are fixed variables that are part of what we call the automatic variables, and this variable is a preference variable which you can change the value contained within it. For example, I can change this value instead of 4096 to something else by pressing enter key, by equal sign, and then I can put like 5500 and press enter. And now if I print this command just underneath it, I will run this command and it will just give me, so I ran the whole code instead, so I'm going to put CLS, CLS. So just run this part of the command, just this part, and then if I run it, now the maximum history count has changed from the previous value, the default value, to 5500. That is because this variable is a preference variable. You may have already noticed that instead of I'm running this entire scripting file, I usually run only the part that I need to run. So how did I do that? Basically, when you have typed something in the Visual Studio Code, you have the ability to either run the entire code, which is this one. So I'm going to put here CLS, enter. So if I run the whole entire code by pressing this button, it will run the entire code just like that you saw. And if you want to just run one part of this code, you can do what you can do is just highlight whatever you want to run. Like let's say I just want to run the maximum history count. I can highlight that and press the button right next to it. And if I click that, it will just run that piece of information. So that's another neat little trick on Visual Studio Code. So during this course, I will show you some tricks and tips as we go through. So basically, I cover two types of variables now, the automatic variables and preference variables. And finally, there's another type of variables. So another type of variable that is very, very useful for our scripting environment, for our scripters like you and me, is what we call the user generated variables. User generated variables, also known as user created variables, are variables that are maintained by you and me, or in other words, users. By default, the variables that you create at PowerShell command line right here, will be only there for that session, and when you close the PowerShell script or close your PowerShell command line, the variable will disappear. In other words, like if I just go in here and if I open the PowerShell 7, and in here, if I create a variable, let's say I will create a variable called A and press enter, that A only exists while this program is running, because this is not a script like we have here on Visual Studio. User created variables are not saved in the core environment of PowerShell. Instead, it only going to get created when the user create them. So for example, if I do variable A is equal to 9555, it doesn't really matter, it's a random number. And if I just print the variable A, press enter, it'll print 9555, whatever that variable contain, it's going to print out. But as soon as I close this window, this PowerShell scripting window, the PowerShell command window, this terminal will basically erase that variable from the memory. So keep that in mind. User generated variables are not variables that are get saved into your core PowerShell environment. It's something that you have to maintain within your script. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to go back to our Visual Studio. So in other words, you can create those variables any way you like, and you can discard them when you don't need them, etc., etc. Notice that all PowerShell variables, including the ones that I can create, like say, let's create a variable, let's call it employee. So I just created a variable employee called Manuja Senanayake. So notice that all of these variables that we are creating here starts with a $sign. The only differences among these variables, so if I run this piece of code, for example, if I want to display that, let's do that. The only difference here in how this is being displayed and how this works is that they color differently in this scripting environment, because the Visual Studio color the automatic variables in white by default, the preference variable in like kind of a dark blue. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. And then the variables that you create, like employee variable, with a different color. So notice that. So it is something that very useful when you're starting out. So for example, I just printed the code for Manuja Senanayake. So right here it says Manuja. You can put whatever, this is just a string. And then, that entire, that basically pull our variable information for whatever we type up here. But all variables in PowerShell start with a $sign. But when the variables are created by you, depending on your scripting environment, it can maybe colored or noted differently. So in Visual Studio Code, which we will be using in this class, you will see that the default variables in white, and the variables, in other words, automatic variables, preference variables in light blue or dark blue, and then the variables you create in in light blue. Now, variables in PowerShells are automatic by default. What that means is, according to your assigned data, it will select the data type. Like for example, let's create another variable. Let's call this variable as salary. And I'm going to say the salary going to be equal to 10. So you and I both know the 10 is a value, like a numeric value, as opposed to employee. So if I run this code, let's say I just want to type salary, and if I clear the screen and then just run only these 2 lines of code, so I'm going to run that, it will return 10. But if I run the employee code, so I'm going to type employee here. So if I'm going to run these 4 pieces of code, so the code will have, we're going to create the variable employee, variable salary, and if I try to display these 2 items right here, I ran the whole code. I mean, if you ran the whole code, you can actually see the salary and the employee shown here as well. So it basically gonna display the items contained within them. It doesn't throw out any error messages. It doesn't give any headaches, etc., etc. So in other words, in PowerShell, it knows automatically this is a string. We know it's a string. The PowerShell knows it's a string because it is between quotation marks. So you can either use this double quotation mark or single quotation mark, as long as the both side, the front and the end of this code contain the same type of quotation mark. So if you want to run the employee, for example, on only this part, you can run it, and what that's going to give you is Sanuja right here. So it just ran the employee designation right here, kind of designate your create a variable here, and then it will basically spit it out that string, because it knows a string because it's between quotation marks. So it could be the double quotation mark. I usually use double quotation mark or single quotation mark. As long as it's the same, it automatically knows it is what type of data the variable is variable has. So basically the PowerShell did not throw out any errors as we go through different variables, even though I didn't declare it. In fact, I can actually combine these variables into one if I wanted to. Like, let's do sum. That's a new variable I created, and I'm going to say equal, and I'm going to do employee. I'm going to say plus, and I'm going to add salary. Now, hey, that should be illegal, because how could the sum contains the employee, which is a string, and a salary, which is a number? That shouldn't be allowed. Well, let's see. So if I type sum here, so which I'm going to print that sum, and if I just run these 2 pieces of code, you can notice it actually came back with a value saying that Sanuja 10. So it combined Sanuja and 10. What had happened here is basically the PowerShell understand that this is a string. PowerShell understand this is a number. However, because we are asking the PowerShell to combine these 2 items, the only logical way to combine it is to combine as a string. So this sum is actually a string. And how do I know this? Because I know how PowerShell works. But if you have no idea how PowerShell works, you can actually check that. So let's see what this sum is about. To do that, what you need to do, you're going to enter the variable name. So sum dot. And then we will use what we call a method. Methods are basically instructions that specify an action which can be performed on a commandlet or a variable or an item within your PowerShell. So the method I'm going to use is get type. So we always going to close this right now. For now, just remember when you are using method, you need to close the the parentheses or brackets here. And there are some methods that can take in variables like the items inside here. For now, we just want to print the get type. And if I run this, if I run all of this part of the code, you will notice that this get type printed that it is a string. But if you type, let's say, salary, and go get type, and if you run that part of the code, you notice that the sum is a string, but the salary is an integer. Right here, so it's integer. So basically, it can combine even various types of data, and it will give you the best possible options. But it is not recommended when you're doing scripting and coding, the mixing information. As a good scripter, you should always keep an eye on things. Like you should do it properly. So I'm going to clear my terminal again. So remember, we can combine different types of data in PowerShell, and we don't have to declare the type of variables when you are creating variables in PowerShell. So unlike many other scripting languages, you don't have to do it in here. Now, I'm gonna save this file first. File, save, and I'm just gonna save this as a different file, version 2.ps1. Just so that I can delete this item, so it will be clean for you. So I'm just gonna delete everything I typed. I'm gonna introduce something else for you to think about. So what if you want to have more than one name in variables? So there are some rule of thumbs that programmers or scripters use when you need to put more than one name into your variable. So one of the ways that you can do is something called camel casing that a lot of people use. Camel casing is basically mean like you start with the variable name with whatever the variable designation. In PowerShell 7 and PowerShell, it's the $, and you can say Manuja and Senanayake. So camel casing is, so I have two names, terms in this variable. I start with the simple letters, and then we have a capitalized letter, and you put something else in here. So this is what we call the camel casing. So like you can create any variables you like. That is a very common method, like for example test variables. So that's called camel casing type of variable. In PowerShell, you can use that, or you can be like this too. So you can put test variable. Microsoft used this method a lot, the test capital and the variable. And you can also do something like $, and you can do test underscore variable. And you can also do things like you can capitalize things. So you can do things like test variable, or you can do a mix and match. So you can do test variable. So it doesn't really matter as long as all of these are valid variables. But one thing you may have noticed already on my screen, that if I click on here, it highlights two lines. When I click on here, it highlights 2 lines, because in Windows PowerShell there is no differentiation between capitalized letters and non-capitalized letters. In other words, this variable is same as this variable. Basically, you created the same variable twice here. Same here. This variable is same as the variable above here, because test, no space, just with a V capital variable, and test with T and V capital variable name is exactly the same variable name in PowerShell, because PowerShell does not recognize capitalized or simple letters. So keep that in mind. While you can name variables any way you like all of these types, it is recommended that you name the variables accordingly, so that you don't repeat the same variable name and structure, because it's going to be the same variable. It's basically going to override this variable with this new variable. So these two are the same. These two are the same. So just stick to one. So what I'm going to stick to in this class is going to be camel casing. So that basically I'm going to say Manuja variable, because it's easy for me to follow. So have one method and just keep going with that method, because that will make sure that you don't create variables in an incorrect way. So let's recreate our variables. So I'm going to say employee name, and I'm going to give it a value of Manuja. And then I'm going to create another variable called employee. Oh no, just say salary, doesn't matter, salary. And I'm gonna call salary 60, it doesn't really matter. And then basically these are the two variables that I want to create. So it doesn't really matter, this is camel casing and this is just a regular. You can create a regular, just a one line variable, one term variable as well. Now, having said that, the next thing I'm going to show you is that in PowerShell we can strictly define the data type for any variables. Remember, this 60 is automatic. So if I actually automatically define, so if I put salary and put dot get type, if you use the get type option, which is the module, and we basically run this, what that's going to do is it's going to give us an integer, because the type of this variable is an integer, it's automatic. But you can actually cast variable into what it needs to be. So in other words, in PowerShell you can actually strictly define data type for any variable. Cast, or some people use the term cast, some people use the term defining. In Microsoft documentation they call it defining. That's actually the proper term. So casting out, defining a variable can force that variable into a boolean, double, integer, string, etc, etc. So like for example, so this is coming back as an integer, and if I cast this as a bool, that variable is now cast into a boolean value, and if I run this code, it'll say boolean right here, because even though it has an integer in here, it is a boolean value and it is now set to true. So you can actually make this whatever you like. In other words, you can declare or define, strictly define your variables, whether it's a boolean or I can make it a double, for example, and this value right now going to be double. So if I run this again, so if I clear this now, and if I run this code right now, it will be now double. So it changed from a boolean to from integer to a boolean to double, because I am strictly defining what this variable should be. For example, I can actually put 60.52356671. It doesn't really matter, whatever you like to want, whatever the value. I just gonna type bunch of numbers in here, and if I put this through and get the type, it will still be a double because it is already casted here as a double. But even if I don't cast this, remember, the PowerShell will still define that as a double. So if I clear this and if I remove this casting right here, or like not casting, the proper way to say it is strictly defining, and if I run this, this will still come back as a double because this is a double. But if I basically strictly define this as an int, even though the value here is double, it will return it as an integer. So if I clear this screen and if I run it, now it's saying it is an int 32. In other words, it is an integer, because even though this is a double, I have strictly defined this as an integer, it's going to return as an integer. So if I type this variable right now, salary, if I display the variable and if I run that code right now, it will return 60. So anything after this decimal point is not going to be displayed because I have casted this or strictly defined this variable as an integer. If we change this integer variable, in other words, the integer declaration here, into double, and then if we run this code, what's going to happen, instead of just displaying just 60 here, it's going to display the entire value, including the items after the decimal point. So if I run this right now, it's going to return the 60.256, etc., etc. The reason for that is this is now cast into a double, not an integer. So previously we ran the same code with the same values, but it returned an integer of 60. But when you run it again with casting this into a double, it just returned the entire value. Keep in mind that integers take up a little bit of more space on your computer, on your memory, than let's say a Boolean value. The double takes more space than let's say an integer value, so on and so forth. So that's why this is there. So basically you can define it in PowerShell, but you don't have to do it as such. So having said that, the next thing I'm going to introduce to you is that you have to also make sure that you follow your rules when it comes to the point you are creating your own variables. For example, remember I told you when you can create a when you want to create a variable, you can create variables such as $, and you can say Sanuja, or whatever you want to call your variable. So let's say Sanuja NetIT Geek. That's a valid variable. You can have all the other types of variables I mentioned, like Manuja Senanayake. So that's basically a camel casting, etc., etc. But there are certain variables, like for example, this variable is valid, that you can't use because it is already part of a variable that is baked into your PowerShell 7. Such as, for example, if I try to do false, it turns blue. Turn dark blue. So this is not a valid variable because this variable is reserved in your PowerShell. Another example would be null. Null, false. All of these variables are defined so that they're just going to return false. It's just going to return null because these are actually null point value we use for null point volumes and Boolean stuff like that. So there are certain variables that are already defined, such as even PS table, PS version table. This is a defined already baked into the PowerShell. So make sure that when you are creating your variables, you don't create variables that may confuse with the baked in variables that are already there. And there are some limitations on that regard. We will go over this as we go through this course in my future lessons, but keep that in your mind, back of your mind, as you move through these lectures. Finally, I want to introduce you to the concept of storing commandlets to variables. So in other words, you can so let's get rid of this. We don't need that. So let's say you create a variable called today. That's your own variable, and you want to store the today's date in there. But guess what? There is already a variable associated with a commandlet associated with getting the today's date, that is get date, right? So we can do equal get dash date. So what that's going to do, the today, this variable gonna store whatever the information associated with the get date. Now if you run this code, it will return nothing. The reason why it returned nothing is because this get date commandlet store the information in the today's variable, but it's not displaying anything, it's not doing anything, just putting it in there. If you want to display that information, you need to call in that variable. So if I enter today right here, so basically call in that variable, and now if I run this commandlet, the variable, it's going to display the information from this commandlet that is stored in this variable called today. So it's showing today is the Tuesday, February 7th, and it is already a baked in commandlet in our PowerShell 7. It's storing into today's variable that we created here, and it's just basically displaying it. You can call your variable whatever you like. So today day, or whatever you want to call it. So if I recall the today day right here, and if I run it, it'll still return the same information. You can also store your variables in variables. So for example, instead of the date, let's say I created a variable for saying PowerShell, and I'm going to call it versions. Remember, you can create variables with underscores in it. And remember, there is a commandlet to get in the PowerShell information. It's not actually, sorry, not a commandlet. I mean a variable that you can use to pull PowerShell version, which is the $sign and PS version table. Now, if I, if I get that, information, if I get, if I post this information down here, so PowerShell version, and if I run this, what's going to happen is it's going to return that information that is stored into PowerShell version. Like I can call this whatever I want. So I created a variable, but I'm storing information from another variable inside this variable. So you can store either commandlet information or other variable information inside a variable that you have created. Finally, one last thing I just want to point out before we end this tutorial is that in this environment, the Visual Studio Code environment, you sometimes get helpful tips. For example, if I put a enter sign right here, and if I leave it, it has this little red, squiggly thing underneath. That means there is an error here. If I go over this today date, it gives me a message saying the variable today day is assigned but never used. In other words, it's basically saying you have a assigned variable but not used in anywhere in the code. So if I actually enter it here, that thing goes away, that yellow line goes away. If I delete the variable call here, the yellow lines appears. So there are little things in your Visual Studio Code that shows up that is very helpful for scripters. We will go over some of these as we go through this course, and we'll go over some advanced configurations as well. I mean the advanced configurations within the Visual Studio Code console. That's everything for today. If you like these type of tutorials, please make sure to thumbs up this video and subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I have already posted few PowerShell tutorials on my YouTube channel. You're more than welcome to go back and check them out. Until next time, thank you so much and have a nice day.